so we can start. Good morning. Welcome to the Palos Verdes Art Center. On behalf of our staff and our Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you to this exciting event today. We're so privileged to be a partner in the One Book, One Peninsula project and to be hosting today's talks with the esteemed author Andy Weir. I'm going to introduce Kathy Gould from the library in just a moment, but before I do, I just am going to go over some logistical information for everyone. So I wanted to let you know that there are restrooms to the right, there are restrooms to the left. There's also a book sale going on in the painting studio. Please purchase a book. They are pre-signed by the author. We will also have food service available in our Stripe Cafe immediately following the presentation this morning. So again, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank our partners, the Palos Verdes Library District, the Land Conservancy, Palos Verdes Sustainable Schools and Gardens, and I want to thank you all for your support. And I want to invite you after the event to visit our galleries and see our exhibitions and become members of the Palos Verdes Art Center. We would love to have your continued participation. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Palos Verdes Library District Director, Kathy Gould.
On behalf of the Palos Verdes Library District and all of our community partners, I'd like to welcome you to our annual One Book, One Peninsula community-wide reading event. As you all know, this year we're featuring The Martian by Andy Weir. Thank you all for coming out on this gloomy, drizzly day. We're actually glad, and those of you who've been involved in past years know that we used to do this in a tent on the library roof. We're actually really glad we're in the nice, warm, dry art center today. When the Palos Verdes Library District first conceived the One Book, One Peninsula program over 6 years ago, our vision was to energize the entire community by the shared experience of reading and discussing the same book. Judging from the response to this year's book selection, I think we've succeeded. That is in large part because of the combined efforts of all of the community partners who come together to sponsor this program. The saying goes that many hands make light work, and while I'm not so sure about light, our community partners have certainly made the work easier, as well as being a real pleasure to work with. So I'd like to restate the thanks that Gail gave for the Palos Verdes Art Center, especially for their use of this location today. They have put a whole lot of work into making sure everything goes smoothly. The Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy, Marymount California University, Palos Verdes Sustainable Schools, and our very own Peninsula Friends of the Library. All of these organizations have participated in the planning, presented Martian-themed programs and events in the lead-up to today, and helped with promotion. Without them, this year's One Book, One Peninsula would not have been possible. I'd also like to thank Terry Gilman of the Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore, who was instrumental in making Andy Weir's appearance possible. And as Gail mentioned, if you'd like to take home a souvenir of today, her staff are selling signed copies of his book in both hardcover and paperback in the studio just over here. Special thanks are also due to the PVLD employees who've worked so hard to make this event a success. Every single department in the Palos Verdes Library District and nearly every employee has been involved in some way. I want to give particular thanks to Deborah Peterson, who's outside right now taking last-minute sign-ins, who is this year's One Book, One Peninsula leader, put in many, many hours of hard work and had many sleepless nights as she planned and worried about every detail. So thank you, Deborah. Lastly, I'd like to express our gratitude to Andy Weir, who has been more than generous with his time, accommodated our request to add a second presentation today given the huge community response, graciously pre-signed copies of his book for sale, and spent all day yesterday speaking to and fielding questions from the students at Palos Verdes Peninsula High School and Marymount California University. As I'm sure all of you know, The Martian is the story of an American astronaut stranded on Mars. He must use his wits, a great deal of science, and not to mention a lot of duct tape, to survive in this extremely hostile environment. The book has been called Robinson Crusoe in a Spacesuit. Library Journal noted about the book that Weir combines the heart-stopping with the humorous in this brilliant debut novel by placing a nail-biting life and death situation on Mars and adding a snarky and wisecracking nerdy hero. He's created the perfect mix of action and space adventure. Andy Weir's own story is the stuff that dreams are made of. He made some money working as a computer programmer at AOL in the late 1990s and managed to make his exit from AOL at just the right moment. This allowed him to fund his dream of becoming a writer full time. A self-described space nerd, Mr. Weir wrote his first novel, The Martian, which he offered as a free download from his personal website. At some point, he decided to sell the book on Amazon for 99 cents. When more and more people began to download his book and review it positively, an agent took notice. And before he knew it, his originally self-published book, The Martian, had made it to the New York Times bestseller list and then became an award-winning movie. I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting things to say today. He's going to speak for probably about 20 minutes, and then he will take questions from the audience. I'll ask that if you have a question, he's going to field questions, so stand up or put your hand up and be sure to speak loudly if you have a question. And it's with great pleasure that I now introduce author Andy Weir.
I've never had quite that kind of an escort on the stage before. Let's give a big round of applause for our artists here. Well, she pretty much described everything that happened, so thanks for dropping by. So when I was a kid, as I was growing up, my father was a physicist, particle physicist working for Martian Laboratory, and my mother was an electrical engineer. So I was pretty much guaranteed to be a nerd from day one. And that worked for me. And Dad, I'm pretty sure, never threw away a book in his entire life. So he had this bookshelf. It's about 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide, about a foot deep, jam-packed full of old 1950s and 60s sci-fi paperbacks, what they used to call juveniles back then. And so I grew up reading Dad's science fiction collection, which is interesting because I was born in 1972, but I grew up reading baby boomer sci-fi, you know. So my idols, the authors that I grew up reading were Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and although those people seem to have forgotten them, I love Clifford E. Simak. And so this is the sort of science fiction that, to me, is what real science fiction is. I always wanted to be a writer, ever since I was a little kid. I think the first thing I ever wrote was, I think I was about 6 years old. I got a hold of my mom's typewriter against her permission, and I wrote a Henry Higgins fan fiction. The Beverly Cleary books with Henry and Ribsy and Beezus and Ramona, all those that was high literature for me at the time. That was I think the first thing I wrote. I don't know why people often ask me, when did you realize you wanted to be a writer? And I'm like, oh, I always wanted to be a writer. At the age of 15, I ended up working for a national laboratory, which makes me sound like some sort of lubricant, but really it was just a community outreach program. The lab, Sandia Labs, which is in Livermore, had this thing where they would hire local high school kids, you know, about 10 of us, to be lab assistants, like test tube cleaners or gophers or whatever. So it's not like I was like such a genius that the U.S. government had to hire me at 15. But the lab I worked in, the first one I worked in was called the Combustion Research Facility, and they were working on a low pollution diesel fuel. And so they had a whole bunch of data from their test runs and stuff, and so huge amounts of numbers just in data files, and they wanted to be able to analyze that data and look for trends and stuff. This was 1988 or thereabouts, so there was no Microsoft Excel. There was nothing like that. There was just computers and computer programmers and data files. That's it. So they said, well, we don't really need test tubes cleaned. We don't really need anything special done here for the lab, but we do need this data analyzed. So there's a computer, here's a disk with all the data on it, here's a book on how to program computers. Get to work. So that began a 25-year career in computer programming for me. Because once I was 18 and it was time to, decide on colleges and whatnot, I wanted to be a writer, but I also wanted to eat regular meals, and I liked sleeping in things that aren't boxes and alleys. So I decided I'd go to computer programming because that seemed like a pretty good, stable career. So I went to college at UC San Diego, not too far away, and I went there for 4 years. I did not graduate because I ran out of money, because that's what my generation does. And so I was, around 1994, I was forced to decide whether or not I wanted to either A, go deeply into debt with student loans to finish my degree, or B, get a job and get paid a whole bunch right now in the now wildly popular tech market. And so I chose B, right? And this was at a time when you could just stumble into a tech company and they'd give you a job. As long as you could stand upright, they would give you a job. So I think my first job, I was making an astounding $18,000 a year, and yeah, I stuck with it. I moved from place to place. For those of you who are the right age range, you might be interested to know that I was one of the main programmers on Warcraft 2. I worked for Blizzard back in the day. That was a long time ago. Then later on, I ended up working for America Online, which was also kind of dating myself because I guess they still exist, but yeah. I got laid off from AOL along with 800 of my closest friends when they merged with Netscape, which is another dated reference for you to really get a feeling for how old I am. Now, around that time, or actually earlier than that, when I was in college, I wrote my first book. It was called The Observer, and it was horrible. Fortunately, I wrote it before the era of the internet, so you can't find it. None of you will ever see it. It existed in a software, on a disk kind of thing that I wrote in, I think it was WordPerfect. And all those files have been expunged from the public record. And then also there were a few hard copies, printouts that I made. Those have all been destroyed except for one that my mother has, and she won't tell me where she's hiding it. So it survives in some form, and she occasionally uses it as leather. But anyway, it was my first pancake, so it was just crap. So, but I think you'll find every writer, the first thing they write is crap. So then the next, so I got laid off from AOL. This is now 1999. And they said, okay, you're out of here, here's a couple months salary, and don't forget you have to sell your stock options in 60 days or they're gonna fizzle. They'll disappear, so you have to sell your stock options. And I was like, I should probably find out how that works. Because I hadn't really paid that much attention to them. And I'm like, okay, I've been working for AOL for 3 years. They gave me this big stock package at the beginning because they didn't want to give me any actual money. And actually, originally when I was working for a company called Johnson Grace, which was bought by AOL about 3 weeks after I started working there. So I had this complicated stock option package with additional stocks and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, well, I got this many stocks, this much vested, I got laid off, there's no penalty there, da, 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 da. This is my strike prices. It's worth just over $1 million. And I was like, oh, hey, that's pretty cool. This works for me. Okay, so I went ahead and exercised my stock options and then, paid a large percentage of that to Uncle Sam. And then I had a bunch of money. And I'm like, okay, so I don't need to, I realized, I don't need to work for a while. I've got a bunch of money. So here's an opportunity for me to take a stab at being a professional writer, try to break into the industry. And so I thought, I'll take a sabbatical. And sabbatical is an awesome word. I love the word sabbatical. It means I'm unemployed. But I say sabbatical and suddenly it's classic. But so I spent 3 years being an unemployed sabbatical, and I wrote another book. I spent a good long time working on it, and that book is not The Martian. It was my second effort. That one was called Pet Product. And honestly, I think that book did have a good plot. I still now think that it had a good plot, it had a good story, good compelling characters, but it was just crappy writing. You know, it takes a while to learn how to do the word snipping stuff. It's like when I try to read it, I'm like cringe, 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 cringe. The plot points are cool, it's just hard to read. After I wrote it, I spent quite a while trying to get interest from publishers and literary agents, and I experienced the standard sob story that you'll hear from every wannabe writer, which is just no traction at all. The nice literary agents were the ones who sent rejection letters, right? So after 3 years, I gave up and said, like, okay, I gave it a shot. I tried to break into the industry. I wasn't able to break in, but I don't need to wonder what might have been. Time to go back into the tech industry. It's recovering from the collapse that had happened in around 2000. And it's time for me to get back to work. And this wasn't a, hang your head, Charlie Brown music type of situation. It was fun. I like programming computers, and I like working in that industry. It's fun. So back I go. Then the internet is starting to get more and more popular around this point. People have their own websites. People do all sorts of fun stuff online. And I realized, well, hey, here's an opportunity where I can be creative, and I can post whatever I want on my website, and I don't need like a publisher or anything like that. I can just put stuff online because, which back then was called the information superhighway. Another dated reference. So that's what I did. I had a web comic for a while called Casey and Andy, and then another web comic called Cheshire Crossing. I wrote a bunch of short stories and posted them on the website. One of them that was pretty popular at the time, which ended up drawing a lot of regular readers to the site, was called The Aid. And that got a lot of people to my site, and it built up my regular reader list. I had just a mailing list. And for the mailing list, I just said, look, I promise I won't spam you or talk about my day or tell you that I'm having coffee at Starbucks. The only thing I'll do with this mailing list is announce when I post new content. And I stuck to that, so that's what kept people from unsubscribing from the mailing list. So I had about 3,000 regular readers around the time that I started writing The Martian. Now for The Martian, what I was doing is it was just one of the things that I was crapping out on this website. It was just a chapter every month or two as I felt compelled to write. And I wasn't even working on it linearly. I mean, well, it was linear, but I wasn't working on it exclusively. I post a chapter of The Martian, then maybe the next thing I do is I post a short story. I post a chapter on one of the other serials I was working on. I was working on 3 serials at the same time. One of them was The Martian. Another one was about aliens invading Earth. And the third one was about a 19th century mermaid. I mean, it's my website. I can do whatever I want. So, and that's all still there, by the way. If you want to read the adventures of Bonnie Mackenzie, they're all there on my website. Anyway, I had a lot of feedback from my readers on The Martian. I could tell it was pretty popular. People liked it a lot. And also my audience that I built up were hardcore science dorks. That's because of the webcomics I'd done earlier. The general theme of my stories was always scientific, because I am a hardcore science dork. So they would email me. Well, first off, I knew that I was writing for an audience of hardcore science dorks, so I knew I had to get the science right. Because these are the sorts of nitpickers who are just enormous pains in the ass. I know because I am one of them. And so, I really put a lot of effort into getting the science right, because at the time I was writing The Martian, I thought I was writing for this tiny, tiny niche audience of people who want to see the map. I assumed. Anyway, so whenever I got anything wrong, I would get floods of emails saying, you have a math error here, you have a chemistry error here. Hi, I'm a nuclear physicist aboard a US nuclear submarine, and let me tell you about RTGs. Which was awesome. It was like having 3,000 fact checkers. It was great. So the science was strong. Okay. So I posted it here and there, and when I post a chapter of something that wasn't The Martian, I'm like, hey everybody, here's a new chapter of Bonnie Mackenzie. I get emails like, yeah, that's nice. So when's the next chapter of The Martian? So I could tell that was a popular thing, and I was having fun working on it. And seeing so many people, excited by it helped motivate me to keep working on it. So that helped keep me going. It took me about 3 years start to finish. I started in 2009 and I finished in 2012. And so I posted the last chapter to my website. It said, everybody, there it is, the conclusion of The Martian. enjoy. And then I figured, okay, I'm done. On to something else, on to maybe start a new serial, or work on some of my other serials, or just work on short stories, or make a new webcomic, whatever. I was just already mentally moving on. And I started getting email from my readers. And they say like, oh hey, Andy, I love The Martian, but I hate your website. And that's completely reasonable, because if you look at my website, it's really ghetto. It's just white background, blue links, left justified. Click one of those links and you get a wall of text. Read. Right, and so it's not very fun to read in that presentation. And so people would say like, can you make an e-reader version? I have an e-reader, the e-reader is a format, and I can put it on my, can you just make an e-reader version? So I figured out how to do that. It was pretty easy. There are a bunch of online tools, a bunch of free tools you can use to turn a document into an EPUB or a MODI. And those pretty much cover all e-readers. All e-readers can read one of those. So I said, okay, here we go, folks. I posted them up online. You can read it in my website, or you can download the e-reader version for your e-reader, knock yourself out. And then I got email from other people saying, oh, hey, love your story, hate your site. I see that you have an e-reader version of The Martian available, but I'm not very technically savvy. I don't know how to download a thing from the internet and put it on my e-reader. Can you just put it up on Amazon? Because I know how to get things through their system. So I'm like, okay, let me figure out how to do that. It's actually very easy. I used Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing, and any idiot can post their stuff there. There's no editorial process or anything like that. It's just you take your chances. You post it and see if people like it. They do hang on to it for 48 hours to make sure you're not posting a bunch of goat porn. But other than that, don't judge. But other than that, once it's up, and people can buy it. However, you are required to charge at least 99 cents. Now, I wanted to give it away. I wanted it to be free, because everything else in it is free. And so I just wanted to give it away, but Amazon actually loses money on every Kindle they sell. They sell them at below cost. The reason they do that is because they know if you buy a Kindle, you're going to buy a bunch of books, and that's where they're going to make their money. So to make sure that that system keeps working, they can never allow people to give their books away for free. There are short promotional periods and stuff that you can do, but you can't just have free content. So I set the price to the minimum, 99 cents, which meant, by the way, that I was pulling out a cool 35 cents royalties per copy. And then I told everybody, all right, you can read it for free on my website, or you can download the e-reader version for free from my website, or you can pay Amazon $1 to put it on your Kindle for you. Knock yourselves out. More people bought it from Amazon than downloaded it for free. Which shows you two things. First off, Amazon has a huge reach into the readership market. And second off, people are willing to pay $1 just to avoid technical hassles. So it started to sell well, or at least it seemed like it was selling well. I couldn't quite tell. I was like, I don't know anything about self-publishing. I don't know anything about what are good numbers, what are bad. I was looking at it, it's like selling between 300 to 500 copies a day. And I'm like, is that good? I don't know. So there was this forum where all the KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, all the KDP people, if you're automatically part of this forum when you sign up for the system when you post it to Amazon. And where all the authors talk to each other and say, oh, how do you you're saying, how do you do this, whatever. And some of the friends were like, post your sales numbers. And that's tough. And see how they do it. And so I read that one of those threads, and people are like, man, I had a banner day, I sold 5 copies. I was like, okay, my book's getting a little more traction than some of these other guys do. It started working its way up into the bestsellers list, into the top 100 Kindle, and then into the top 10 for sci-fi, then it made it #1 in sci-fi, and into the top 20 of all Kindle. And so it started really selling well. Over 5 months or so, it sold about 35,000 copies, which is good. And that got the attention of Random House. So there's an editor at Random House named Julian Thevia, and he had this recommended to him by other people. Some of his subordinates said like, hey, this ebook is doing really well. You might want to consider a print edition of it. So give it a read. And Julian was like, I don't know, this looks kind of like engineering porn. I don't see that this is really that interesting. so he was talking to a colleague of his named David Fugate, who was a literary agent. And he said, all right, David, yeah, he was talking to him about it. David said, well, if you're not going to read it, I'll read it, I'll take it. So he's like, yeah, go ahead. So David read it, and he liked it, and then he came to me and said, hey, you need a literary agent. And I was like, so after 3 years of not being able to get a literary agent, one comes knocking on my door. That was cool. So I went online and researched him to make sure he's a real person and not a Nigerian prince or something. And then I'm like, sure, be my literary agent. And they were like, great. He turns around and says, okay, Julian, how much are you going to pay us for this book? So that was nice and predatory, I got that. And so they started working out a print deal. So that was exciting, this is all my dreams coming true, right? Around the same time, 20th Century Fox came for the movie option. So that's exciting. Now, movie options aren't nearly as exciting as they're portrayed in movies, strangely enough. You'd think they would know, right? It's not like some guy in a tailored suit comes in and says, hey kid, we're gonna make it, stop. No, it's what they're doing. A movie option means they are buying the exclusive ability to buy the movie rights. You got that? Okay. So what you do is you work out the entire movie rights contract in advance. You work out all the little details of the movie rights contract, what they'll pay, all the clauses, everything. And you say, this contract is not in force. This contract, we have not agreed to this yet. It's just sitting there in limbo. Instead, we have a little contract that says that the studio, in this case Fox, can activate this contract at any time in the next 18 months by paying me this large amount of money. And they could just choose not to. And to get me to be willing to do that, they pay me a small amount of money. So they're paying you a little bit of money, you get the exclusive ability for 18 months to buy the rights. And then after 18 months, the rights devolve back to me and they use that ability. And I get to keep the small amount of money. Now, there are a lot of authors out there who are very prolific, have like 20 or 30 books under their belt that they have published. And movie studios, once they acquire an option, they really don't want to let go of it. But usually they don't make movies out of it, right? They'll acquire something like 200 or 300 options for every movie they actually make. Because they buy these things like fragments. I mean, and the amount of money you get for an option isn't that much, compared to movie. So there are authors who just live on that. There are authors who just live on these, movie studios cycling the option. It's like, oh, wow, this year 4 of my books are coming back to me as movie rights. I was like, who wants them? It's pretty cool. But at the time, everybody told me, okay, don't get too excited. All right, this is just a thing that studios do when they see what appears to be a popular book. So anyway, we worked out all that deal, and the whole movie rights deal was this big negotiation and stuff, because Fox is a pain in the ass in a lot of ways. And then also the book deal was going on. These two negotiations came together, and they were both agreed to 4 days apart. That was an eventful week for me. By the way, at this point, I'm still a computer programmer. So I'm sitting in my cubicle, fixing bugs, and running out to take a call about my movie deal, and then back to the cubicle. It was kind of surreal. And the day both the deals came together, I had to take a day off work, the week that they came together, I had to take a day off work to just kind of lay down. So, everything was coming together nicely. And then eventually the print edition came out, it did very well. It got immediately on the New York Times bestseller list, and it started selling like hotcakes. And that made the studio care about it. They were a little more impressed. And they had a screenwriter, well, it's actually Drew Goddard, who was one of the writers on Lost. He wrote a bunch of episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He wrote Cloverfield. He directed Cabin in the Woods. He's an industry veteran. He created and wrote the new Daredevil series that's on Netflix. So he's a mover and a shaker, and he loved the book. And so he said, like, I want to write the screenplay and direct this movie. So he got to work writing the screenplay. And then while he finished the screenplay, and then he started chopping it around. And the studio said, like, well, also right around all this time, in the middle of all this, Gravity came out. The movie Gravity came out. And that's when Hollywood said, oh, hey, movies about space can make enormous amounts of money. Make note of that. So then while Drew was shopping it around looking for actors, Matt Damon said, hey, yeah, I like this. I'll play the central role. And the studio's like, oh, really? That's cool. And then right around that same time, Drew got offered the director's chair for the next Spider-Man movie. And so he's like, well, I gotta do that. His first love has always been comic book stuff. I mean, that's why he created the Daredevil series and all that. And so he says, well, I gotta do that. So he left the project to go work on the next Spider-Man movie. So now we went from having a director and no star to having a star and no director. We had a great script though. He'd written a great screenplay. And so then they said, well, let's see if we can find a director that we like. And Ridley Scott said, I'll direct it. And they said, that's the director we like. So once it was Ridley Scott and Matt Damon were both signed on, then it was pretty clear that it was going to get greenlighted. But what's weird is there isn't a moment when you pop the champagne. There isn't like a go, we're greenlighted. This is happening. It's like it just kind of edges closer and closer to actually being in production. It's like, well, we cast a few of the other actors now. Okay, we've got a production designer. Oh, okay, we're working on the costumes now. Well, they're actually building sets at this point. Good. Okay, well, all the actors are in Budapest, which is where they filmed this studio work. They filmed it in Budapest, Hungary, tax breaks and all that. And they're like, okay, well, we think we're going to start shooting on the 10th. Okay, we've shot a scene. And that's when everything comes together, because at the point that they shoot their first scene, a whole bunch of legal stuff happens. First off, they have now generated intellectual property based on my book, which means they have to buy the rights. And so that's when they send you the check and activate the contract. Then also, the first scene they shoot means they are now on the hook to pay the actors all their entire salaries. So Matt Damon got something like, I think, $30 million or some huge amount of money. The first scene they shot with him in it, they now owe him that. So I'm like, okay, now you're committed, you have to make this movie. Yeah, and then the movie came out, of course, and it did very, very well. It was like tops in the box office for quite a while. Made huge piles of money, got nominated for 7 Academy Awards, won none of them. But, you know, that's not my problem, I wrote a book. And so now, like, my whole life has changed. I was once a computer programmer, cubicle dweller, and now I'm going around and talking to strange collections of people in weird, affluent cities. I was just down here last week. I didn't get to go to the red carpet event. I, for the release of Martian, which was in Toronto, and it's like a whole other country up there. And then, yeah, you guys know Canada. Yeah. So I didn't get to go to the red carpet event. I went to a whole bunch of publicity and marketing events. So I met that cast and Ridley lots of times. Went to the Oscars last weekend. That's fun. That's cool. Yeah, so I got nicely all tucked up and cleaned up pretty good. Like you said, I wore the really good overalls that I had. It's like I both sides of the overalls when you go into a formal event. And scrape the mustard stain off. Yeah. But yeah, so my life has completely changed. I'm a fairly extroverted guy, which is, I'm told, rare among authors. Usually authors want to stay in their cave and be left alone. And I'm like that sometimes, but I also like interacting with people. And I really miss my job as a computer programmer. When I left my job, it wasn't to take this job and shove it in the situation. It was kind of like, I was like, I'm gonna miss this because I liked my job, I liked my boss, I liked my coworkers, and it was like the social network, right? It's like I could every morning, walk in, morning Steve, morning Bob, morning, and there's people sitting around, joking around, people to talk to, everybody gets their coffee and get to work. We're collaboratively working on a project, and that's what computer programming is. It's a team effort. We're all doing our part. And I really like that feeling of being on a team. And that's completely gone as a writer. When you're a writer, you are totally by yourself. The nice thing is you're a dictator, right? You don't have, you're answerable to no one on what happens in your story. But the bad news is, it's like, okay, it's time to start my day. Guess I'll step over to my computer. I'm at work now. So it was a change. But it's a change for the better. I'm on my dream, and I got to do that. So I'm pretty happy about that. So, that's the end of my kind of prepared stuff. I'm going to start taking questions in a minute, but before I do, I'm going to pre-answer the first questions that everyone asks. So question number one, which 8 of you were about to ask me, how much involvement did you have in making the movie? All right, my main job in the film was to cash the check. Once they buy the rights to your film, they can do whatever they want with it. And I'm sure you've all seen movies that don't even remotely resemble the book, and that's why. Because unless you're somebody like J.K. Rowling or Stephen King, you don't get any creative control. You need a lot of clout to be able to get that into a contract. And I'm a nobody, so I don't get to do that. Fortunately, Drew really, really liked the book. So he chose to involve me. He didn't have to. None of them had to involve me at all, but they chose to involve me, which was really cool. So he was on the phone with me almost every day when he was writing the screenplay. Sometimes for creative input, but usually for technical stuff, like checking an app and saying, well, wait a minute, well, explain this part of the physics to me. Because they all agreed they wanted to keep the science as realistic as possible in the film also. While they were filming, I would get questions from Ridley occasionally on technical stuff. Like, once again, like science and math and chemistry and stuff. It's not like Ridley Scott needs my creative advice, but you know, any question like, hey, can we show more pouring hydrazine from one container to another out on the surface of Mars? And I'm like, no, the hydrazine would boil off and Mars is low atmospheric pressure. And then they're like, okay, well, we won't do that. There were a few tense moments where I was like, oh crap, they're really going a direction I don't want to go. One of them is that Ridley Scott is a production designer first, and then kind of a director in his spare time almost. Like, he got his start as a production designer. So he's actually an incredibly talented artist. I don't know if you've ever seen any of his sketches and stuff, but he's very, very good at that. And he has a real feel for, like, look at things from this angle, then this angle, then this angle. He storyboards everything out before he films anything. And that's one of the reasons he's so fast. He's always ahead of schedule because he's like, I know exactly what we're going to do with this scene. So the camera's up here, 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 film, done, next scene. And that's great. The bad news is that he really, really, really cares a lot about how good things look. And so he was like, Cape Canaveral looks awesome. It's got rockets standing up, it's got the ocean, it's got palm trees, it's got big impressive buildings like the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is this, you know, huge, like, it's taller than a Saturn V, this building. This is where you build big, tall rockets, right? And so he's like, that place looks awesome. But Mission Control and Johnson Space Center is in Houston. And he's like, Houston's boring. It's just a city with a bunch of buildings, it looks like any other city, but Cape Canaveral's awesome. And having 2 locations for the NASA scenes might confuse the viewer. Why don't we just say all the NASA stuff is at Cape Canaveral? And I'm like, it's, they astronauts, when they're talking to Earth, they call it Houston. Right? I mean, Houston, we have a problem. It's not, oh, Tallahassee, we have a problem. So, fortunately, Drew and I won that argument, so I was pretty happy about that. But what they did do was they had this weird amalgam not plate. Yeah, if you look at the exterior shots of NASA in the movie, it's like Johnson Space Center, Houston, Texas, and there's the Vehicle Assembly Building in the background. Okay, so the Vehicle Assembly Building is where you assemble vehicles. So unless they were going to put that thing on a nice tracked vehicle and carry it all the way from Houston to Florida, that's not where you put the Vehicle Assembly Building, but that's okay. Anyway, a lot of fun there. One other thing I'd like to talk about before I start taking questions is scientific accuracy. A lot of people ask me, well, you put a lot of work into scientific accuracy in the book. Where'd you screw up? That's the lesson. The biggest scientific accuracy in the book is that in real life, a Martian dust storm would not be able to do anything like the damage that's depicted in this story. Mars does get storms that have winds of 150 kilometers an hour, which is like 100 miles an hour. It's big, very, very fast winds, but Mars's atmosphere is 1/200th the thickness of Earth's atmosphere. I mean, it's almost a vacuum. So while it is moving fast, it doesn't have a lot of inertia behind it. And it would be difficult for a Martian dust storm to knock over a piece of paper, let alone a 27-ton spacecraft. So I knew that. At the time I wrote it, I knew that that was wrong. And I didn't care. Because I was making that concession to make an exciting story. At the time I wrote it, nobody else knew that. Like only a very, very small number of people knew about Mars's atmosphere, and that Martian dust storms aren't like Earth sandstorms and stuff like that. But now the Martians come out, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye have told everybody about it, so now everybody knows. So that's one mistake. Another, and there are a bunch of other things that we found out after the book came out. So for instance, my book came out, the text was finalized, and it was going to go to printers when Curiosity landed on Mars in the real world. And so in the book, Art goes through this huge, extremely dangerous process to make water. He takes leftover rocket fuel, he goes through this chemical reaction to liberate the hydrogen, he gets oxygen from the CO2 in Mars' atmosphere, and then he mixes them together to make water, and he pulls himself up a little bit, and he has some problems. Okay, this is all because at the time I wrote it, the belief was that Mars's soil, Mars's atmosphere, everything was just completely arid. Like there was just like no water to be had. Okay, so then Curiosity lands, goes, scoop, hey, there's a shitload of water in this dirt. Turns out, Mars has enormous amounts of ice crystal water in the soil. So much so that if you were to take your refrigerator at home and fill it up with Martian soil, and then you were able to heat it up and pull all the liquid out of it, all the water out of it, you would have 35 2-liter bottles full of water. So instead of blowing himself up with rocket fuel, all he really had to do was bring dirt in and heat it up. But I had two things to say on that. One, the science that was known at the time that I wrote the book said that Mars was completely dry. And two, Curiosity is in Gale Crater, which is like 3,000 kilometers away from Asid Valley, Indonesia, where the Martian takes place. So I say Asid Valley, Indonesia is a desert. And no one can be wrong in place in a probe. Let's see, one other fun thing is that, I just had it a second ago, I just complete brain melt. Oh, it's gone. I'm not very bright. Okay, so we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah.
Well, let's go with you, sir.
Rebel, or which comment did you see San Diego?
Rebel, I want to rebel. Yes.
Hi, my name is March.
Hey-o.
I'm a writer, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm into a lot of things that you do. What amazes me about your story, make one comment and then I'll ask a question. What amazes me about your story is how you turn things around in terms of people, copyright, and there's so much infringement. I feel like they get free computer science, and their mechanics push through, and they turn everything around and have this incredible work. My question is, what are you working on next, if anything? And would you ever, because you like working with other people, would you ever consider working on a series for television? Because that's how you feel about the golden age of television.
Yeah, so the two questions were, I'll repeat the questions as people say them. So the two questions were, first off, what am I working on next? And second off, how would I feel working in a collaborative environment like a TV show? Okay, so the first question, the answer to the first question is, I'm working on the next book now. It should be out in hopefully early 2017. It's another realistic science fiction story, similar to Martian. It does not take place in the Martian setting, it's not a sequel. It takes place in the 2080s, 2090s time frame, and it's about a city on the moon. And the main character is a woman, which is, we'll see if I can pull that out. So hopefully it doesn't seem, hopefully she doesn't seem like a guy who ended up a woman. Anyway. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of the TV show, yes, I would love to work in a TV show, because that would give me all the things I like, writing and collaborative work. And in fact, I'm pitching a TV show right now. I can't talk about it, but I am pitching a TV show, and if it got picked up, I would happily work on that. And yes, I also agree it's golden age of television. And in fact, although I'm a novelist, so you wouldn't expect to hear this from me, I think TV is like the best storytelling medium. Because first off, it's visual, you can tell stories very quickly. The audience, the viewer doesn't need to commit enormous amounts of time to it. They can just enjoy it at their leisure. And it's an infinite canvas. In a book, you have like a few hundred pages to tell your story. If you start getting up into the 800-page range, then people are going to start to go like, okay, that's not that. In a movie, you have an hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe 3 if it's something epic, to introduce characters, introduce conflict, have all sorts of stuff happen, conflict resolution, climax, epilogue. And you've just got 3 hours to tell that. But if you've got a TV show that's popular, if you've got something like Lost, there's all sorts of stuff going on. You can wander off for an hour on minor characters' side plot. It just adds so much depth and richness to the story and the setting. So yes, I would love to work on TV. Yeah.
Hi, I see the value of the future of humanity in space. What can I say to those who are seeking a nuts and bolts, dollars and cents sort of justification for the effort?
All right, what is a good economic argument in favor of space travel? Here you go. If we ever get the price to low Earth orbit low enough that middle-class Americans can afford to go to space, there will be a space boom similar to the airline boom of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. The reason for that is once you get that price down low enough that people can go, they'll want to go. People will build space hotels up there to service them. If you can getting to low Earth orbit is the hard part of getting into space. Once you get to LEO, getting like to the moon isn't that much harder. So if you can drive the price down and down and down, then you will eventually create the space industry simply because humans go wherever humans can go, which is why we have people living on the at the base camps of Mount Everest and in the rural Alaska and at the South Pole. I mean, this is what humans do. So the question is, how do you get that price down? I've done some math. You would need to get the price down to about 50 to 60 bucks per kilogram to LEO to make this a commercially viable, feasible situation. The current price to get into space with the most efficient rockets that we have, which are the SpaceX Falcon 9, costs only over $2,000 a kilogram. So how do we divide that down so much? Well, for starters, space research is still, despite the fact that we've been doing it for 60 years or so, it's still really in its infancy. I want you to imagine if you took a plane from New York to London, a nice new shiny 777, and you go from New York to London, then you get off the plane, and then they throw the plane away. And then, when you go back, they gotta make a new plane. Okay, that's the way the space industry works right now. So reusability, that's the key. Now, how do you jumpstart this industry when there's no immediate demand for it? Like right now, sure, people would be more than happy to pay $5,000 to $10,000 to spend a week in space, but there's no way to make that happen right now. Right now, it costs millions and millions. So how do you drive the price down if there's no economic incentive for the trip, for the process of driving the price down? Well, that's why I love the commercial space program. I love that NASA is saying like, okay, we're going to start outsourcing our launches to SpaceX and Boeing, and not just one contractor, because if the government outsources to one contractor, that contractor just charges as much as they can get away with. They contract out to two, or at least two, so that they're in competition with each other. Honestly, I think the airline industry, if I were to tell you, if I were to go to 1903 and tell you, because you're immortal, you were alive back then, and I tell you like, okay, the Wright brothers just managed to make their kind of, motorized kite fly about 100 yards. Okay, in about 40 years, we're going to have planes that can casually and safely fly across the entire Atlantic Ocean. You'd be like, I'm not buying that. But it happened because of economic forces and competition. And one of the main things we owe that to is competition between Boeing and Airbus. Honestly, that's what drove pretty much the entire airline industry was Boeing and Airbus competing to make better and better aircraft. So if we have things like SpaceX and Boeing competing, or SpaceX and Aristide, or SpaceX and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, is now a private company, as of a few months ago. If we have that competition, then it'll drive the price down. And it's this magical point at which it'll take off and be and be a huge profitable industry. And once that happens, it'll start generating a lot of tax revenue, right? Because people will tax it. And then we will make back all the money that we spent investing in the space industry. There's my nuts and bolts economic. Oh, you. Two questions. First one was, did I have the story of the Martian planned out when I posted it, when I first started? And the second one is, what were my first two books about? I had the very, very basic plot outline for the Martian in mind. I knew, okay, he's going to get stranded. There were a few cool scientific problems I wanted him to face. I had a rough idea of how the climax was going to work, but that's it. I didn't have much else to go on from there. So mostly I made it up as I went along, which was cool. Also, science drove the plot. It's neat because I made sure to double check all the math and stuff. That's, for instance, the water plot. I was like, oh, he's going to need a whole lot of water to grow. A lot more than he has access to. And that created this whole really interesting side project that I would have thought of. The first two books I wrote, the first one was called The Observer, and it's this thing, dystopian society thing. Rebels fighting against an oppressive central government. Kind of like the crap that happens now in science fiction. All these like young adult dystopian future things that are coming out that I can't even tell apart. Yeah, it was like that. The second one was called Pep to Pride, and that one you can actually find that one online. And I do think it was a good plot. It was just kind of poorly executed. It was about it takes place in a future where there's in the distant future, and there's aliens and astronauts travel and all that fun stuff, and it's kind of like space opera style, like Star Trek. Like the aliens are all, you know, about 6 feet tall, comfortable in the same atmosphere as and all these other implausible things. And it's about a big heist, like a stealing of diamond from a museum. So that's what the second book is about. Yeah.
If you live or win where you're able to live space or Mars, would you like to go
Would I go to Mars or space as a commercial travel? No. And no interest in going into space. I'm a great kind of misfit. I write about great people. I'm not one of them. How about Orange there in the back?
I have two questions. Number one, for science fiction, so you go to World Times. Are you going to be at the World Science Fiction in Kansas City this year, this summer?
Am I going to be at WorldCon in Kansas City? No, I'm not. Sorry. Sorry.
Look up for a Hugo nomination.
Second question, is my book up for a Hugo nomination? No, it isn't. Because the way that the rules of the Hugo work are, it has to be for that year, right? And so the way they count the year of publication is the year that it was first available for sale. So when I self-published it in 2012, that means that 2012, as far as the Hugos are concerned, 2012 is the year the Martian was released. And no one had even heard of it until like 2014. And so it just was never eligible. And considering all the crap that went down in the Hugos that year, I'm probably glad I wasn't there.
We go to all of them. And that's the, I'm a scenic arts model. You have with way you create a movie because they do take an arts creation and they distort it so much. You have with what happened in the movie and were there aspects of the movie that you did not like? Characters or storyline or anything like that.
Right, the question is, was I happy with the movie and was there anything in it I didn't like? I loved the adaptation. I think it did a fantastic job. It really followed the book very closely, which is kind of rare on film adaptations. And so I was thrilled about that. They did have to cut a bunch of stuff out, and that's fine because if they hadn't, the movie would be like 5 hours long. So the stuff they did cut out are things that I agreed were the best things to cut out. Like if I had been given the task of cutting stuff out, I would have cut out pretty much the same thing. My only regret in the movie is that they got rid of my Aquaman joke. I had an awesome Aquaman joke in the book, and and it didn't make it into the movie. Sad. They put it in some of the marketing material, but they didn't put it in the movie. And it's not gross or crude or anything. It's just they didn't find a place to fit it. And then let's see, the thing I love about the movie though, and it's like, was just all the kind of Ridley Scott is almost famous for his kind of landscapes and scenery. It's like all of his movies like really show you the world in which they're taking place. Like, you know, in Blade Runner, you see the cityscape everywhere, you know, and so on. In Martian, so you get to see just Mars, all this just fantastic Mars. Most of that was just shot at Wadi Rum, Jordan, which is desert Jordan. That really does look like that. I mean, it really looks like Mars. They had to digitally edit out plants and stuff, but other than that. And so it was just really satisfying to see that the visual imagery of the landscape of Mars, because you can't really describe landscape in a book. You can, but you can either spend like a couple of sentences briefly describing it in the hope that the reader's imagination takes it from there, or you can spend pages and pages describing it and the reader will throw the book over the shoulder. So that's the thing I was happy with. How about, let's go with the back in black.
We can obviously tell that Marwani got his sense of humor and wit from you. I was just wondering, how do you think you would fare if you were the Martian?
How do I think I would fare if I were in this situation? Oh, I'd die. Mark is based on my personality, but he's better than me at everything that I do, right? And he doesn't have any of my flaws. So he's kind of the idealized version of me. He's what I would wish I were. And I think you'll find that's pretty common among protagonists in any book. You pick up pretty much any book, the protagonist is somebody the author wants to be or someone the author wants to have sex with. I believe you, pick up any book. For the record, I want to be one. All right, blue in the back. Yeah, how do I feel about people who make comparisons between it and Interstellar because Matt Damon was stranded in space again? I didn't really care, and for the most part, like the test audiences, before the movie released, we showed it to test audiences, like none of them even mentioned Interstellar in their post-interview stuff. So it didn't even, that comparison didn't even get into most viewers' minds. Yeah, way back. He claims there's a spiritual sense to Martian, and if I could speak to that. Well, first off, I don't think anyone would accuse The Martian of being literature. It's just straight up thriller. It's like problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. It's not really, I didn't have a message. I didn't have a moral. I don't do that. My only purpose in writing a story is to entertain. I'm not trying to change your mind on anything. I'm not trying to preach any subject or ideology or anything like that. Although some of my own personal kind of belief systems did read through. And one of them is that I really do believe that people are inherently cooperative. And I really do believe that, like, yeah, it makes news and we really notice when people are bad to each other. But what we don't notice is that people helping each other out and cooperating and is so ingrained and automatic for us, it's not even noticed. It's like if someone gets lost in the mountains, yes, 1,000 people go look for them. We don't even consider that news. It's like, well, of course you do. Well, think about that for a minute. Think about that. That's how we're wired. That's how we are. That's what humans are like. So I have this really kind of positive view on humankind that leads through, but that wasn't intended to be a message. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind on stuff, but yeah, that's how I see it. Great.
Speaking of positive view, the book starts out with NASA administrators unwilling to point a telescope at where the dead astronaut might be, and then halfway through, they won't tell the other astronauts that they left somebody behind. What was do you have some basics for that, or do you worry about that? Maybe that's the way they really run the program.
Well, so there's two things. It's like, do I think it's plausible that NASA would not look at the Ares 3 site And then the second thing was, do I think it's plausible that NASA would not tell the Hermes crew that Mark Watney is still alive? So 2 things on that. Well, first off, the first one really was for plot reasons. I wanted him to be completely isolated and for nobody to know he was still alive for quite a long time. So I came up with the idea of the PR nightmare of showing a dead body. I think it was fairly realistic. Also, they had astronauts on the scene at the time, of the disaster, so they wouldn't really feel the need to check it again with a satellite in orbit. They had people on the ground and their helmet cams. I mean, they knew the entire layout situation there. So it's not like they had to go out of their way to find new information. That's why they invented the whole subplot of Vincent or Vincent in the movie going, saying like, ooh, maybe we could have an Area 6 mission because we've got a whole bunch of our assets in there. I just wanted there to be a delay. As for not telling the crew, yes, I really do believe that NASA would conceal that from the crew. As a role, they're intensely focused on survivability and safety of the crew, and the last thing they would want to do is introduce this huge psychological trauma to the crew of a ship that still has 10 months of space travel to do. A real world example of this is during the events of Apollo 13, when they were coming back in, there was a chance that their heat shield was cracked. And they didn't know for sure, you just had no way of knowing whether or not the heat shield was cracked. And since there was nothing they could do about it, they didn't tell them about it. They said, they just did not tell the crew that their heat shield might be damaged. So yeah, concealing information from astronauts is a time-honored tradition. How about you?
What was your Aquaman joke?
What was my Aquaman joke? In the book, Teddy is looking out at the sky, waxing philosophical, going, oh, what does that do to a man? He's up there all alone. He doesn't know that we know he's alive. What is he thinking? What's going on through his mind? And it cuts immediately to Mars, and he's like, how come Aquaman can control whales? They're mammals. Makes no sense. How about Blackjack?
How much interaction did you have with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory when you were writing the book?
How much interaction did I have with JPL when I was writing the book? None. I didn't know anyone in aerospace at all while I was writing the book. I was totally on my own. So all of my research was just Google. But it's the space industry, the whole space world is like very, very open. People post, I mean, all this information shows up in scientific papers that are posted online. It's all very, very public. It's not like, I don't know, it's not like other industries. There aren't a lot of trade secrets and stuff. So, yeah. Who's better?
I had a question that I was going to ask, but because of what you said in response to the other man with the spiritual aspects, I wanted to tell you something that struck me in the book, and maybe you haven't said this before. I didn't feel like it was an intentional message you were trying to send, but in the part of the book where people from all around the world are suddenly watching what's happening to the sky, and the screens up at Times Square and Times Square and whatever. That really touched me, actually, as something that, as we're so reminded daily of how divided we all are as humans, we divide ourselves into groups. That made me realize something like that would make everyone realize we're just one group, and that's one of our guys up there.
Yeah, it's all of us.
It was a very touching moment.
Yeah, when there's a general human instinct that I think is part of our evolution that made us work as a really successful species on this planet is if any of us are in trouble, all of us care. And that did happen, by the way, in real life when the Apollo 13 astronauts were coming back. People were out in like Times Square and like in major cities all over the world, just like watching with bated breath. It was like those astronauts were our guys. Even if you were in Zimbabwe, those were our guys, you know. Okay, well, first up, the organizer, how are we on time? Okay, we got a few more questions. All right, lady in the denim jacket.
Yeah, I've talked a lot with people about the books that they choose, and sometimes it's like the first line grabs me, or what's the best first line in the book? When and how did you pick your first line?
How did I pick my first line in the book? It was the first line I wrote. I just sat down and said, like, oh, let's get started on this. All right. Pink, pink. The extremely masculine gentleman in the pink shirt. Yeah. Actually, yeah. Is there another way I could have stranded in there that would have been scientifically accurate? Well, there are lots of ways that I could have stranded there via equipment failure and stuff like that. But it's a man versus nature story, so I wanted nature to have the first punch, right? So that's why I wanted that to work out that way. I have since learned, and I didn't know it at the time, I learned from NASA's director of Mars operations, Jim Green. So he's like the equivalent of being at the board. He told me, and I didn't know this, Mars has lightning. So Mars has lightning just like Earth. It has cloudy lightning out of the ground. I could have had a lightning strike start a cascade failure, and that would have been cool. So if I'd known that, I probably would have done that. All right, we're going to do, let's see, 2 more questions. Let's go to the lady in the back.
Why Mars?
Why Mars? Okay, well, first off, Mars is the next obvious place for us to explore because we've been to the moon, and so it's now time to go look at Mars. Second off, it is out of everywhere in our entire solar system, including the moon, but not including Earth, it's the best place to attempt to colonize. In the future, Mars has all of the building blocks necessary for life. It has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It has its entire atmosphere is carbon dioxide, so there's your carbon and your oxygen. Tons of water in the soil, as curiosity told us. Nitrogen, 2% of its atmosphere is nitrogen. So if you have those elements, and in abundance, which Mars does, you can grow a biosphere, an Earth biosphere, as big as you want. So you wouldn't need to ship material from Earth to grow your biosphere. You would just get bigger naturally, you can collect materials from Mars. You need to build domes and stuff to hold in pressure and protect yourself from radiation. I'm not saying it'd be easy, but that's the obvious place. Now, some people ask, why not Venus? Well, Venus is hell. Venus is closer to Earth. It is definitely closer, but it's moving so fast around the sun, it actually takes more fuel to get there than it takes to get to Mars, because you have to catch up to it. And then second off, Venus's atmosphere is 90 times the thickness of Earth's atmosphere. So being on the surface of Venus is about the same as being, I think it's like 100 meters underwater. It's like that amount of pressure. Also, it's 500 degrees Celsius on the surface, which is about 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So the longest the probe has ever lasted on Venus was a Soviet probe that lasted an astounding 14 minutes before it melted. So you don't want to go to Venus. Venus, in fact, has such a thick and nasty atmosphere, there are speculations that it could have standing lightning. Standing lightning, meaning that here's a high point, like a mountain or something like that, and then there's this constant storms, there's 300 kilometer per second winds and stuff like that going on, and they generate so much static interaction between the clouds that there is a constant lightning bolt just striking the top of those mountains. Standing lightning. Don't go to Venus. All right, we're going to do one more question. So this gentleman here.
You ought to be able to do anything you want to do in life because of the income from the books.
Oh, yeah.
Once you get out of your system, you need to cooperate with other people.
Well, I really like telling stories. I would love to work on a TV show. But in terms of my large infusion of cash, I did do a couple of silly impulse purchases. One of them is I bought a Martian meteorite. So I have a walnut-sized meteorite that is from Mars. And the reason that happens is every now and then, there'll be a celestial event, a big-ass impact will happen on Mars and kick the Martian material completely out of Mars's gravity well. Then it will spend 1 million years or so wandering around the solar system until something that happens to come to Earth. And every now and then they'll find these meteorites, which are called sugartites. There's this whole history behind sugartites that I won't go into, but it took them a long time to realize sugartites were from Mars. And so they go like, oh, sure. So now they have a small collection. There's only a few hundred of them in the entire world of meteorites that originated on Mars. So I bought one of those. That's a nice silly impulse purchase for me, right? The other thing I did was I installed a restaurant-style soda fountain in my house.
glass.
I like Diet Coke more than the Pope loves Jesus. All right, I think that's the end of it. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy Weir. That was beyond our expectations. Thank you so much. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today. Before you go, I want to let you know. Now he's out of control. See what happens. All right, before you go, I want to remind you of two things. Please visit our exhibition galleries. We want to share our art with you today, and we have something really special, $5 tacos. So on your way out, if you're hungry, please stop in at our Stripe Cafe. They have a wonderful lunch planned for you today. Thank you.
Great.